Please tell us what happened the night of June 13th. Be as specific and detailed as possible.
Look, I'm going to make this as quick as possible for the obvious reasons. I will give my version of the events for why I was fired, and you're going to do your damnedest to try and get me my severance package, or at least something to keep me going in between jobs. How does that sound? Do we have a deal? It started about half a year ago, when I had just moved to the area. I was looking to pick up some work as a veterinary technician, but there were no clinics hiring. I decided I would take any job that came my way to make ends meet until I could get my foot in the door at one of the veterinary clinics in the area. As you know, I managed to land a security job at a nearby hospital. It was this hospital to be exact. It was a pretty job. I walked around on patrol every hour or so, struck up conversation with the nurses and patients when I was feeling chatty, and spent the rest of my time reading A Song of Fire and Ice. What? It's not like you can fire me twice. You would be surprised what I caught some of the other guards doing when I stepped in to relieve them. I'm just trying to give you a feel for my routine and lay all the cards out on the table. June 13th began as a pretty quiet night. There were no belligerent drunks that needed to get their stomach pumped, and I didn't have to restrain any junkers who were fiending for another fix, but were stuck on detox. I liked these nights the best of all, where I don't have to worry about a drunk vomiting in my shoe or have to talk a problem patient back into their beds. By the way, in the interview, the boss man said nothing about how to restrain patients that weren't free to leave. I'm just saying, with a little more training about protocol, maybe we wouldn't have had the situation we did, and I wouldn't be talking to you through that night. Anyways, it was around 8 o'clock that I got the call from the boss. He told me that the hospital was about to be getting a very important patient and asked me if I felt up to the task. I told him yes, because there wasn't another option. He could try to call someone else in for work for my 8 PM to 8 AM graveyard shift, but there wasn't a snowball's chance in hell he would find someone on such short notice. I agreed to watch the VIP, even though I had no real clue of what I was doing. I decided to ask the charge nurse for some information about what hospital security typically does with important patients. I assumed that it was probably some B-list celebrity who had gotten tipsy at a club and rolled their ankle on the dance floor. The charge nurse told me what I had already assumed. I would be sitting in their room, making sure to keep any media or strangers out while doctors treated her. I asked her if she had any idea who was coming in and what she was. And that was when she told me it was Christine Parker. I had no clue who that was. The charge nurse was apparently a big fan of America's Most Wanted and watched it every week before it was cancelled. She told me that in 2011, an 11-year-old had gone missing on her way home for school. This girl, Christine Parker, had apparently been missing for over 3 years until today. She was picked up on the side of the roads from a nearby forest by highway patrol. She was set to arrive at the hospital in 30 minutes to treat the injuries she sustained in the escape from her captor. I did a quick walk around the hospital to make sure there weren't any news crews setting up outside. Apparently the police misled the media by telling them she was being sent to a larger metropolitan hospital, while quietly sending Christine out to a hospital in the boondocks. Of course, this meant that they had to post up near the hospital they told the media about, otherwise they would catch on to their duplicity. Their ploy had worked, and there was no one in sight. The girl would be allowed to convalesce in peace without media buzzing around her like flies on a turd. Christine arrived and was taken up to the OR wing of the hospital. This wasn't because she needed surgery, but because the OR was shut down on the weekends. I always assumed it was closed because the surgeons wanted some time to play a round of 18 holes on the weekend without having to worry about checking in on their wards. She was brought into the OR because there weren't a whole lot of people there, and it would be easier to keep all non-essential personnel out of the way. There were a flurry of doctors around her, and I couldn't really get a good look at her through the whirlwind of white coats and nurses' scrubs. I caught glimpses. She had dirty brown hair that looked like it was a bird's nest and hadn't been combed in a long time. There were scars along her arms and legs that, I am fairly certain, didn't stop at the sleeve of her clothes. Her right hand was shattered, and it looked like it had been shoved into an industrial trash compactor. Bones poked out of her hand like pins in a pincushion. She was emaciated and looked like she had been through hell. The doctors took a blood sample and left to run some tests and order a few scans. The nurses pulled the curtains and helped her change into some scrubs. When they pulled the curtain back, I saw that the scars indeed did not stop at her sleeves. The nurses asked some basic questions and then went on their way to treat their other patients. The only information I caught was that she was 14. She didn't know if she had any allergies, and she had been held captive in the woods for over 3 years. Once the nurses left, it was just me and Christine in the hospital room. I had no clue of what to say to her. She was obviously shell-shocked. I'm not really a conversationalist, so I tried to keep my trap shut and not look at her injuries. I didn't do a good enough job because she caught me looking at her hand. "Hurts like hell," she gasped and raised her hand to her mouth as if she said something horrible, and I tried to put on my best smile and told her that it was alright if she wanted to swear. She continued by telling me that he wouldn't let her swear. It was here that I breached protocol and asked her what had happened out there in the woods. I wanted to have that information ready for the police when they arrived, so maybe I could save her the trouble of rehashing it to 2 stone-faced officers. I remember the time they asked a rape victim to describe her attacker's genitals, who then broke down at being forced to remember that trauma. I tried to give her that one mercy and protect her after she had been exposed to so much. She looked down and said, "The hand doesn't hurt as much as you think. I think the fact that I had time to steel myself for what I had to do. I needed that hand broken so I could slip the cuffs. I had to do it, otherwise he would take it from me again." Do you understand? The kid smashed her own hand up. She did it so she could slip the cuffs. I then asked the question that I wished I never asked. I asked what her captor was going to take from her, thinking maybe he had given her a puppy or a doll to assert control over her. Christine lowered her hand to her stomach, and for a second, I thought she was having some intestinal issues, until she said, "I'm late." The horror of that statement barely had time to sink in before she continued. She said that she had missed her period before, and when her captor found out, he beat her viciously. She told me that he kept striking her until she was on the ground, and then he kicked her in the stomach. She started to cry, and there wasn't a single thing I could think of to say to calm her down other than, "It's over." Around this time, a nurse arrived and gave Christine a sedative. I think they did this so they could examine the extent of her injuries without causing her any more pain or the trauma of reliving it. I hate to say it, but I was thankful. She was out cold. I didn't want to hear any more about the horrors she had to endure for 3 years. The scars and improperly healed bones were a testament to the tortures she had suffered. I watched over her for a few hours. I tried not to look too closely at the hundreds of scars, some calloused and healed, while others looked like they were weeks old. The soles of her feet were blackened and cut up from running through the woods for miles while seeking help. I tried to not look at a mangled right hand that she had stomped and broken so she could slip the cuffs off. I tried not to look. It was around 5 o'clock when the man showed up in the OR. I was getting ready to kick him out when he asked if I was watching over Christine Parker. He was an average-looking guy. He was wearing jeans and had a wary look to him. I told him that I was watching over a private patient whose identity had not been known to me, just like the guide tells us to say. I thought he was some vulture from the newspaper who had slipped in, but that was when he told me that he was her father, Richard Parker. He kept pressing, and eventually I relented under the condition that I stay in the room while he was there. I brought him into the room, and he stood over the broken body of his girl. It looked like he was about to break into tears at the sight of her injuries, but he managed to keep himself under control. As she was unconscious, there wasn't much he could do or say to her. He stroked the side of her face, and then sat down next to me. We sat in silence for 5 minutes, before he struck up a conversation with me. He told me all about his daughter, how she liked those frilly Disney princesses, how she used to be so afraid of the dark that he'd had to buy a nightlight, how he used to carry her around on his shoulders. It was here that he really cried. He buried his face in his hands and wept. He looked like a man who was weeping at a funeral, which in a sense, I guess he was. The daughter he knew had died. She would live a scarred and emotionally damaged life. He took a couple of minutes to get himself under control. He told me that his wife would be here shortly. We talked a little more. It was mainly small talk. I can't remember what we talked about exactly. He was more focused on Christine than talking. But I think he felt uncomfortable with the silence. I don't have an exact time, but I think we probably dragged the conversation on for an hour or so. It was around 7:30 when Christine started to come from the sedative. Richard Parker noticed her stirring and rushed to her side. He stroked the side of her face as she opened her eyes. He leaned down and planted a kiss on her forehead and whispered something into her ear. He turned towards me and told me that he promised he'd let his wife know when she was awake. He left for the main lobby just as my radio went off in my ear. He was my boss, radioing in so he could take over my shift. I went down to the command post and greeted my boss. He typically showed up 15 minutes early to let me off with a couple of extra minutes. He asked me how it went, and I told him that it had been pretty quiet, except for when the father visited. A look of confusion crossed his face, and he told me that Christopher and Regina Parker were supposed to be coming in at the noon, so the doctors and nurses would bandage and treat her before the reunion. The realization hit me like a foot stomping onto a hand. I sprinted back towards the OR. I sprinted down the hallway, dodging nurses and doctors alike. Christine was bone white, and the look in her eyes confirmed my worst fears. She sat, frozen on the bed. She looked like she had seen the devil himself, and to her eyes, she probably had. I was out of breath from running, but I managed to wheeze out, "Who was that?" She spoke in a whisper, but it felt like she was shouting the words right into my ears. "It was him," I croaked. "What did he tell you?" She looked up at me, and in that moment, her eyes were as wide as saucers. She said, "He told me that he loved the time we spent together and that we should do it again." The rest of the words caught in her throat, and she broke down wailing and weeping. My boss arrived at around that time, and I was fired almost on the spot. That's my story. I know I messed up, but how could I have known who that guy was? Well, now that I say it out loud, I guess I really was in the wrong on this. I doubt I'm going to get a termination package. This trip out here was a waste of time. Well, not completely. Maybe I'll go give Christine a visit. Why are you looking at me like that? What's going on here? This whole interview wasn't about my severance or wrongful termination. This interview was about Christine. Oh God, is she alright?
Christine has been missing since last night. We have no clue where she could be. I was a part of the medical staff at Stockfield General Hospital for a couple of months. The pay was terrible, but it kept food on my plate and I felt valued, even though I had only just joined. It seemed pretty normal to start with. Yeah, you got the occasional patient who'd be absolutely raving, and they'd be pretty scary. But it wasn't as if I was going to quit my job over a couple of schizos. Then, in the middle of August, I came across an inconsistency. A patient, James Brookson, in his early 20s and suffering from cancer, just disappeared. There was no record of him being signed out. He simply just vanished. I had spoken to him just the day before. I asked a few of the other staff members, but they didn't remember him. The only reason I remember the guy is because he asked me to contact his wife, whom he divorced some time ago, to apologize and to say that he still loved her. So I checked the records to see if he had just been moved to another ward. However, his file didn't appear. It was as if he never existed. The computer couldn't have accidentally done that. There were far too many safeguards. Someone deliberately deleted this guy from our system. So I searched through the backup records. I found him, and yet there was barely any information about the guy. There was just a tag, HF, and a record saying that he had been moved to the Oxley ward. I had no idea what HF meant. The only time I ever heard it being used was when the caterers referred to the hospital food. And as for the Oxley ward, never heard of it. There was no record of it on the hospital layout, and the other staff had no clue as to what it was. That night, when I got home, I looked up the hospital's blueprints online. There it was, in the basement, just down from the catering area. When I got into work the next morning, I was in a much brighter mood. I had found my patient. Me, being the idiot that I was, had probably forgotten he had just been moved. After completing my normal rounds, I headed down to the lunch hall. I planned to use the rest of my lunch break to check on him in the Oxley ward, when I was interrupted by the hospital's director. I never liked the guy. He always seemed to be searching for some reason to dislike me. Today, it was like he had deliberately crossed paths with me, even though he acted surprised when he saw me. His voice sounded on edge as he spoke, and his bushy mustache twitched in a peculiar fashion. "Ah, Scott. Good to see you. How's your day going?" "Oh, good. Thank you, sir," I replied. The way he spoke was odd, strained, and slightly hurried, as if he wanted to just skip over the small talk and get to a more pressing subject. "I've been meaning to speak with you. It's a happy coincidence that we met," he said, eyes darting up and down my face as if he was trying to see if I suspected him of wrongdoings. "Oh?" I responded, wondering whether or not it was actually a coincidence. "You see, I've been hearing from the other staff that you've been inquiring about some, what was it? Oxley ward. Is that right? Because I've never heard of it." I knew at that moment our meeting definitely wasn't a coincidence. His voice had taken a very controlled, practiced tone. Yeah, I said. "I lost track of a patient and the record said he was moved there. If you want, I could help, although I'm sure we don't have a ward by that name." My brain went haywire. He had to be lying, but why? There was definitely an Oxley ward on the plans. "I was just going to use my break to try and find it," I said ambiguously, not mentioning the basement. "Oh, didn't you hear? Janice called in sick. You're going to have to sacrifice your break, I'm afraid." I walked back to the Curie ward, damning the manager to hell. I grudgingly continued with my rounds, not fully concentrating and thinking about the mystery of the Oxley ward. A woman caught me muttering to myself about it and asked me if I was okay. Out of frustration, I snapped and told her to screw off, which I think scared her a bit. Suddenly, my shift was over and I almost ran to the basement. I wasn't going to let some bastard director interrupt me this time. As I got down there, I was horrified by the stench. The dank smell of rotting meat burrowed into my nose, causing me to gag. My eyes started watering, and I stumbled over to a large pair of double doors. The sign said Oxley Ward, and I frantically threw open the doors, though I wish I hadn't. Bodies littered the floor, with arms, eyes, and stomachs missing. A huge oven seemed to be cooking their severed limbs and organs. I retched. Some were still conscious, groaning, calling to me to help them. Their jarring screams cut into me like knives. I looked around. Deep crimson was all that filled my eyes. And at that moment, I realized what the HF meant. What I thought laughable when I first saw it. Hospital food. This was where James was taken. He was taken here and cut up and cooked and fed to the other patients. Oh my God. I had eaten hospital food just that day for lunch. Had I eaten my patient? Twisted catering staff stood there, meat cleavers in hand, staring at me. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" one of them asked angrily. I knew exactly what I was doing. Grabbing a grimy knife from one of the unclean surfaces, I began walking towards them. Anger filling my body. I was going to do to them what they had done to so many patients before them. The knife flashed through the air, slicing their bodies to pieces as if they were rag dolls. I hadn't known if I would be able to take them, but they were caught off guard and clearly obese. For half an hour I was in there, blindly stabbing into them. Then I ran, gagging from the blood that covered my clothes. People stared at me as I charged through the wards, aimlessly running for the exit. Gasping for air, I burst through the main doors and embraced the light. Suddenly, I was knocked to the ground and my vision began to blur. Blackness clawed at the corners of my eyes and I gave up, letting the bliss of unconsciousness embrace me. Case file 11372. Scott Jameson. Patient suffers from extreme paranoid schizophrenia and constructs intricate plots to explain his delusions. He justifies murdering a room full of catering staff by claiming they were using patients to make the food. Patient still believes that he is living outside of this place, even though he has been moved to the DSPD ward. He has so far made 6 attempts to kill doctors, whom he believes are government agents sent to stop him from spreading the truth. We cannot allow the public to know the truth. Patient must remain in this institution until a time at which he can be executed.
My friend and I went urban exploring a few months ago at this old abandoned hospital. The old equipment was still there, just dirty and beginning to rust. The whole building reeked of puke and strange chemicals. The walls and floors were covered in dust and dirt. We walked down to the morgue, and suddenly there was this crashing sound. We opened the door to get out of the hospital as quickly as possible. But then we saw it. That thing. Its eyes were closed, but it still seemed to stare straight at us. Its legs were broken, so it dragged itself along the floor. It wheezed as it breathed, and its bones clicked as it moved. It wasn't a patient, though. It was wearing surgeon's clothes. We both made a run for it. Even if only one of us got past it, at least we could tell somebody. We could make people aware of what we saw. As I came up to the thing on the floor, I jumped over it. I was free. I kept running, but that's when it hit me. I couldn't hear my friend anymore. I turned back slowly, but they'd vanished. Both of them. I tried to warn people about the hospital, but nobody would believe me. They said I was mad, and that my friend had moved away, and that I wasn't coping with it. But now I know I'm not crazy. It followed me to my house. I heard the abomination every night as I closed my eyes. It would thump across the floor. It would wheeze as it struggled to drag itself along. Its bones would click as it moved its body. I'm not living in that house anymore. My shrink said I should take a break. What he meant to say was, "You're crazy. We're putting you in a loony bin for a while." But it followed me there too. I could hear it every night. Thump, wheeze, click, click, click. Thump, wheeze, click, click, click. It got to the other patients, and one by one, they began disappearing. They tried to cover it up, said we were ready to be released, but I knew different. They closed that place recently. I can imagine it'll become just like the hospital. I can still hear him thumping and wheezing and clicking around my new home. But I keep the door to my room closed and the windows shut and the cupboard's doors chained together. I'm not going to join it, even if it was my best friend.